So to put these in a table, up to 6.2 weeks, slow heart rate is anything under 90, a normal heart rate is anything over 100 or above, and in between is borderline. 6.3 to 7 weeks, these all go up by 20 beats per minute. Another finding that indicates that even though the embryo is alive today, even though we see a heartbeat today, there's an increased risk of subsequent pregnancy failure, is a large subchorionic hematoma. Here you can see on the lower image, there's a gestational sac, an embryo. We do a M mode, and you can see that the heart rate is 152 beats per minute. That's fine. What isn't fine is that there's a large complex fluid collection adjacent to the gestational sac, a large subchorionic hematoma. And this means that even though the embryo is alive today, there's an elevated risk for pregnancy failure. Note, though, that this was worrisome but not definitive finding of problem in that, that's why 4 weeks later, everything looks fine. 4 weeks later, the fetus has grown, heart rate is fine. It's measuring 165 beats per minute. And in fact, the subchorionic hematoma has resorbed and everything looks normal. Some numbers for the risk of the risk associated with a first trimester subchorionic hematoma, the risk of subsequent pregnancy loss. These numbers come from a paper published by our group in radiology in 1997. You can see here that the likelihood of pregnancy loss as a function of the size of the subchorionic hematoma, if there's no subchorionic hematoma or a small subchorionic hematoma, the risk of loss is the same. So a small subchorionic hematoma is clinically irrelevant. A moderate-sized subchorionic hematoma, and these are all classified subjectively. A moderate-sized subchorionic hematoma had a risk of loss of about 20%, or about 3 times as high as the risk in a pregnancy with none. A large subchorionic hematoma had a likelihood of loss of about 40%, or a 5-fold increased risk. But note that even though 40% likelihood of loss is pretty high, there's still a 60% chance that the pregnancy is going to make it, like you saw in the prior slide, when there's a large subchorionic hematoma. So subchorionic hematomas, if they get moderate to large, are worrisome, but far from definitive that the pregnancy is not going to make it. This is a small, what we would categorize as a small subchorionic hematoma. I don't even report these. This I consider to be basically a normal ultrasound in the early first trimester. Another pregnancy, it's alive. You can see the heartbeat, but notice the yolk sac sitting beside it looks large. I don't routinely measure yolk sacs, but if it looks large, I put the calipers on it. You can see it's measuring 9 millimeters. Anything above 6 is normal. So this is worrisome. It's worrisome, so we follow up worrisome pregnancies, and you can see here that a month later, there was no heartbeat, and the embryo hadn't grown nearly as much as we expected. It was about 9.5 weeks size, suggesting that it had, the heart continued beating for about 2.5 weeks after this 7-week pregnancy, but then stopped. Well, let's move on to the second main diagnosis that we consider in women with first trimester bleeding or pain, namely ectopic pregnancy. So again, when the woman comes in for with first trimester symptoms, especially early first trimester symptoms, the main 2 things that we're looking for on an emergent basis are failed pregnancy or ectopic pregnancy. The location of ectopic pregnancy is as follows. The most common location, representing about 95% of ectopic pregnancies, at least in pregnancies that are achieved naturally, not via in vitro fertilization. 95% of ectopics occur in the in the fallopian tube, in particular in the isthmic or ampullary or fimbrial portion of the tube. In other words, some part of the tube outside of the cornu of the uterus. Uncommon ectopic pregnancy locations, which represent about 5% of ectopic pregnancies, but higher than that in pregnancies achieved via assisted reproductive techniques such as IVF, include a heterotopic pregnancy, one in the uterus and one outside, one ectopic. Another uncommon pregnancy is ectopic pregnancy is in the interstitial portion of the tube. In other words, the portion of the tube that goes through the cornu of the uterus. Cervical pregnancies, intra-abdominal pregnancies, and cesarean section scar pregnancies are all uncommon locations, and these, again, as a group, form about 5% of ectopics. The following table is something that we find very useful in diagnosing and helping us to diagnose or rule out ectopic pregnancies. And this table, again, comes from a paper published in radiology by our group at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. What we looked at, we did a so-called meta-analysis of the studies in the literature looking at the following. Looking at what the likelihood of ectopic pregnancy is in a patient with a positive pregnancy test, symptoms of bleeding or pain, and nothing in the uterus. So what's in such a patient, and this patient is what we call a rule-out ectopic patient. There's a positive pregnancy test, symptoms. If she has nothing in the uterus, what's the likelihood of an ectopic pregnancy as a function of the adnexal findings outside the ovary? This table shows it. If in this rule-out ectopic patient with nothing in the uterus, no intrauterine gestational sac, if we see in the adnexa a mass with an embryo or a yolk sac, the likelihood of ectopic is 100%. We've diagnosed it if we see a mass in the adnexa with an embryo or yolk sac. What if we see a adnexal lesion outside the ovary that's surrounded by a bright ring called a tubal ring? That indicates, based on our meta-analysis, about a 95% chance of ectopic pregnancy. But in fact, if you see any complex or solid mass in the adnexa outside the ovary, the chance of ectopic pregnancy, if the patient has a positive pregnancy test, nothing in the uterus, and a complex adnexal mass outside the ovary, the chance is still over 90%. If we see free fluid, a lot of it, in a rule-out ectopic patient with nothing in the uterus, her chance of ectopic is high. We weren't able to quantify it in our meta-analysis with a number, but the chance is high. So anytime the adnexa are abnormal outside the ovary in a rule-out ectopic patient, the chance of ectopic is either 100% or is at least high, and will be, and the woman in general will be treated for ectopic pregnancy. Now the flip side is, if you have a patient with a positive pregnancy test, symptoms of bleeding or pain, nothing in the no intrauterine gestational sac, if the ultrasound is normal, or, and that's normal in the inside the uterus, normal in the adnexa outside the ovary, really doesn't matter if we see anything in the ovary. Anything in the ovary inside in a patient with a positive pregnancy test is almost certain to represent a corpus luteum. A corpus luteum is a normal part of early pregnancy, and it can look like anything. It can look like a simple cyst, a complex cyst, a solid mass. So really, anything in the ovary in a patient with a positive pregnancy test should be ignored as a corpus luteum. So any normal ultrasound with or without an ovarian lesion in a rule-out ectopic patient with nothing in the uterus, that indicates about a 5% chance. So a normal ultrasound in a rule-out ectopic patient doesn't absolutely rule out ectopic, but the likelihood of ectopic is pretty low. It's about 5% if the ultrasound is completely normal.